About her. She's Professor Emeritus at Dublin City University, and she was a visiting professor at the University of Cape Town and also at Peking University in Beijing, where she's returning in October. Her work as an historian traverses the interconnected realms of science, philosophy, culture, and politics, most particularly in her seminal work, Marxism and the Philosophy of Science. Her intellectual journey from a civil rights and anti-war activist in the United States to her deep political engagement with Ireland, with South Africa, with Greece and beyond, has forged a rigorous Marxist framework, I think, is that fair to say? It is this framework that she brings to bear on our topic today, on Zionism, which she analyses not simply, as a simple ideology, but as a material colonial project, situating the struggle for Palestine firmly within the history of global anti-imperialism. Her work, including her recent book, Navigating the Zeitgeist, provides not just theoretical clarity, but an urgent call to action. A long-standing supporter of the Palestine cause, she endorses the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement as a vital form of international solidarity. In her own reflections on periods of setback, she reminds us defeat is not death. It is with a spirit of resilient, principled commitment to justice that we welcome her to chair this.
I'm not used to getting such an introduction just to chair a session. Especially this one, because I told Kevin that there are several hundred people here in Dublin alone that would be more qualified to introduce this theme and chair this session than me. Because there's a very high level of knowledge and activism in Ireland about Palestine over a long period, not just this particular crisis in Gaza. And it's one of the things that makes me proud to be a part of this country and a citizen of this country. But, you know, I haven't been one of the most outstanding people in writing and organizing around Gaza, although I've been, you know, quite active on many things for a long time. But I think that, and also a thing about Ireland that I think is different, especially from the country in which I was born, the US, is that there's a very high level of consciousness of the rest of the world. Actually, Rory Quinn once said to me that in a harbor, the small boats know where all the big boats are, but the big boats aren't necessarily keeping their eye on all the small boats. I think that kind of applies to Ireland and its relation to the rest of the world. And I think in terms of both governments and people, Ireland has been relatively good on Gaza, horrendous on Ukraine, but that's another story. But Ireland is very outward looking in a way that, you know, often does make me quite proud. But I think even those of us that have been preoccupied with other things, I've been quite preoccupied with China, as Kevin has indicated. But I think that there are certain parts of the world that even if we're not specialists in them, you know, we have to pay attention. I mean, top of the list is the USA, because it's wreaking so much havoc in the world, you can't not but see it. And no matter where else you're talking about, the US and its declining empire and the destruction it's let loose is part of the story, a key part of the story, anywhere that you're talking about. China is another place. I think that Ireland isn't very good at focusing on China and its importance in the world, and I'm going to try to play more and more of a role in that because I have a rare opportunity to come and go and to study it. But another place, obviously, is Palestine, and at the moment Gaza. I mean, it's just important. It's impossible not to see what is happening. I mean, on one level, there are the details. There's the destruction, the devastation, the total destruction of the institutions of the society. Not only the buildings of schools and universities and shops and homes, but the lives that, led in those buildings, the structures of everyday life that are tied up with those buildings in this society. The level of devastation. I mean, even those who haven't been killed or maimed for life, just the sheer struggle to live an everyday life is almost unimaginable for those of us who have, much better conditions of life. I mean, even just, one day I came in, I turned on the radio, I usually have RTE current affairs in the background when I'm doing ordinary things around the house. And one day I just heard an Irish doctor talk about one shift in a hospital in Gaza. The number of children he had to pronounce dead. Those that he left with, did his best in very difficult conditions to enable to live, but, broken lives. Even those that aren't physically broken, who knows the mental devastation of all of this. But there are levels and levels and levels of it. And because I'm a Marxist, I always try to think, what does this mean systemically? How does this particular crisis, this war, fit into, first of all, a historical context, and then a contemporary geopolitical context? What does this mean, what's happening in Gaza? And I think that there's a systemic meaning to it. I think the whole global system in which we live, which is capitalism, is in a whole new phase. It's in decline. It's decadent, but it is still very, very powerful. It touches everywhere. It touches every struggle. It touches everywhere in the world. It's impossible to get away from it, from the level of devastation that it wreaks on the world. And there's also something new about it. I mean, people like us call attention. A lot of people are just so caught up in the details of the Trump administration and the outrageousness of it that people are already looking at the, Biden administration and previous U.S. administrations with, rose-colored glasses. But in terms of Gaza, I don't think they feel much of a difference. But here is a difference. I mean, that a lot of things that the Democratic administrations won't say out loud, the Republican administrations, and particularly the Trump version, do. I mean, a couple of years ago, Jared Kushner said something about Gaza being prime seafront property, so you knew they were thinking this. But to have the President of the United States say this out loud, just clear away the people of Gaza, dump them on the neighboring countries, and then make this an international 10-star luxury resort for, the oligarchy of the world. Somebody said, well, what about Palestinians? Oh, some Palestinians, if you can find some rich enough, they might be able to, live in this paradise that they're going to make out of this rubble of Gaza. I mean, it's those of us that have been around and seen terrible things in the world aren't that easily shocked. But, there's still things that can shock us. And this is one. So all the hidden agendas aren't even hidden anymore. And there's a bigger thing. It's like, it isn't just Trump and MAGA, the whole MAGA movement. Capitalism itself, the global system itself, is evolving in such a way that there are increasingly no criteria anymore. That they don't even feel they have to justify whatever they do by any criteria, whether of logic, of law, morality, evidence. It's just might is right. And this is prevailing on a frightening scale. And it's much bigger than, the outrageousness of Trump and the people around him. This is a bigger systemic thing. And it's a lot of my future agenda is to get at the whole, at this, this destruction of all criteria for judging and justifying and doing anything. This is like the whole mentality that's being generated by this system, which is decadent and yet still dominant. So in this context, I want to introduce the theme and the speaker. Philip O'Connor is an independent researcher. He's a regular contributor to Irish Political Review. His work combines research and analysis, which often involves taking issue with mainstream views. He's been very involved in both research and activism on Palestine. And he's also, by the way, referring back to my institution, he's a PhD from DCU. So I introduce him to take up this theme of Zionism and the future of Palestine.
Hello everybody, and thank you first to Tony Coughlin for asking me to talk today, and to Helena, to Frank and everyone involved. These meetings are extremely important. I'm not going to go over ground that you'll all be very familiar with in terms of what's actually going on in Gaza today and the horrendous nature of it and so forth. But I want to try and get to the root of what is Zionism. And the title I was asked to speak on is Zionism and the Future of Palestine. And when I thought about it, I said, why don't we call a spade a spade? What we're talking about is Jewish nationalism. It is the expression of the Jewish nationalist movement. I'm always one for, words tend to lose their meaning when they become disembodied and almost slogans. It's like the word Nazi or fascist, or they become so meaningless because they're thrown around so much. And everyone, the word Zionist is thrown around, and people know it's something to do with the way Israel is behaving. But maybe I just want to kind of drill down into that a little bit, to try and give a picture of what it is, okay? And secondly, in that context, what is the nature of the Palestinian resistance, and what is its future, which looks so grim at the moment, but what is the basis for a future for it? I'll also look briefly at the role of the Irish state. I was in the Irish Palestine Solidarity Campaign years ago, and then I was a member for about 6 years of a group called SADACA, the Irish Palestine Alliance, and we focused mainly on trying to lobby politicians, because we thought if we could get the state to do things, rather than just, if you like, demonstrating our outrage at what was going on, but focus the state on its duties in this regard. And we had some success. We were involved in the early days of the Occupied Territories Bill, the first drafts of that. And also, which really surprised me, with Eamon Gilmore, who I'd regard as generally quite an opportunistic social democrat, but he did actually take it up at EU level and tried to make them live up to their obligations under the Israel-EU Association Agreement and its famous clause on upholding human rights in the territories it occupies. So he did raise it, and of course he was a total voice alone in the EU. That was after one of what did the Israeli minister call it, mowing the lawn, when they go in periodically on a punitive expedition into Gaza or whatever and mow the lawn, cut down the population a bit, get them behaving themselves again, so on. And it was after one of those, occupation caste-led or one of these things. So I want to focus, so I'll start and then just throw out a few ideas for maybe that can be discussed. And we can go into things in more detail talking afterwards. I don't want to take up the whole session by any means with just me talking. I remember that during my days with SADAC I produced this study of Palestine in Irish politics, which actually traces the history of the Palestine issue and the Irish state. And we also, at the time, which we lobbied in the European Parliament with, it was called the European Union's Blind Eye, okay? And it was about the impunity with which Israel was allowed to act. And it quoted all the European texts and that. And we did get some response from politicians at EU level, but anyway, we all know the problem there. Okay, so I'll just start off. You know, when after the Palestinian breakout from the Gaza prison camp in 7th of October 2023, Netanyahu launched his so-called war in Gaza. And as he did so, he told his troops, which is a genuine citizens' army, I mean, this is a democratic genocide, you know. He told his troops, remember what the Amalekites have done, says our Bible, and we do remember. Like to most of the Western press, this was a totally obscurantist reference and didn't know what to make of it, and they just passed over it. But for an army that's deeply imbued with an identity of what Dublin Zionist Oliver Sears has explained is both at once a religion and is national, the comment was as good as an order. The Amaleks were a tribe who in the ancient biblical mythical accounts, or semi-mythical, whatever, attacked the Jews as they were leaving Egypt several thousand years ago. And God, according to the same source, told them, go and attack Amalek, utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Wipe them out, okay? And you'll find that in 1 Samuel 15:3. And every child in Israel knows what the Amaleks are and know what they were, what being told, remember the Amaleks, what the meaning of that order was, okay? And this is what they have since done. Several issues have become abundantly clear since the start of this current Holocaust. There is widespread shock in the public, especially in Ireland, which is one of the better informed Western publics. Not only at the words and the deeds of the Israelis, but the sheer sadism, enjoyment and cruelty which is exhibited by them as they have gone about it. I think this is what has shocked people very deeply. You expect brutality from armies, but the sadism and the enjoyment of it is what has shocked people. And it immediately brought comparisons with what we all know about the Nazis and their various demographic solutions. And these comparisons were simply so stark and so obvious as to make any need even to demonstrate it superfluous. We also saw the columns of semi-naked prisoners herded into sand pits with the guys with submachine guns standing around the rim of the pit. I mean, it was so resonant of photographs we've all seen from the Second World War. Everything that happened at the food collection points, which I don't need to go into for you. And when it came out, I think it was even on BBC it came out, a soldier who had been there, or an American contractor who had been there with the soldiers, who revealed that they had a type of sport. One day they would target children in the head, next day and then on the day of the actual broadcast they were targeting young men in the testicles. Okay, this was the sport. Again, reminiscent of things which we all know about. And also, I thought from the very start, one of the most hideous things they did was when they killed people like Hamas politicians, Hania, remember, who was actually involved in the negotiations, or when they killed that first Al Jazeera journalist, the first of 250 journalists they've killed. They don't kill them first, they kill their families first. First was a strike in their home that wiped, I remember Hania, 50 members of his extended family were wiped out in a strike, including his brothers and sisters, cousins, parents, children. And I remember seeing him the next day at some conference and someone was whispering in his ear telling him what had happened. He was just in shock but tried to carry on in his role, and the next day he was blown away. But they did that first. And they did the same, I remember, with the first Al Jazeera journalist they killed. First they wiped out his family, left him a few days, he struggled on trying to do his work, and then killed him. So it's the nature of the violence. Like Helena, as a cultural anthropologist and so on, could probably probe that deeper than I could. Another thing that shocked us, I think, and it was really especially shocking to a lot of people on the soft left, was the complete absence of any opposition to this in Israeli society. Sure, there are large demonstrations, but these are all about getting the hostages home, all 20 of them. Or they're displays of domestic partisan opposition to Netanyahu or whatever. But they are not opposition to the war per se. There are small groups doing so, and recently a bit more and more you see it, calls to end the killing. I've even seen the word end the genocide on a placard at one of these demonstrations. But these are tiny groups. These are utterly marginal. And this contrasts with the 80s or the 70s. There was still a big, remember the Peace Now movement? They could mobilise hundreds of thousands demanding trade, land for peace. There's none of that now. And this really is difficult for our soft left, if you like, who all say, oh, it's all because of the far right this, the far right that, Netanyahu's far right. Well, that implies there's something to the left of them. And what we've discovered, that in Israeli society there isn't much to the left of Netanyahu. In fact, the major opposition to him is to his right. Recent opinion polls in Israel showed over 80% were either not concerned or not very concerned with the plight of Gazan civilians. A common comment about Gazan children is that, well, if they grow up, they'll become Arabs or terrorists. Okay. And at the same figure, over 80% thought the IDF was either going in with sufficient force or should go in with more force. Okay. The next thing that was shocking, I think, to the public in Ireland was the impunity with which the EU and the US have treated Israel. Anything Israel does was totally excused up to recently, and now there's a bit of humming and hawing. While they're trying to rush their thousands of peacekeepers into Ukraine and all that, no one says, why don't we send some peacekeepers to Gaza? Where under the Genocide Convention they're legally required to prevent a genocide. And this is despite the fact, and here we have a growing dichotomy between the people and the political class. A New York Times poll recently showed that 80% of the Democratic Party's base in the US regard what's going on either as a genocide, that was the majority of them, or at least mass murder. But we find no resonance of that view in the political class. And the actual actions of European countries, despite beginning to say Israel has gone too far or is going too far or whatever, and trying to get them to temporize their actions, not least to wipe the blood and gore from their own their own complicity from their hands. But what are their actual actions? It's to declare Palestine Action in Britain a terrorist organisation and rounding up people in the streets for it. It's police in Germany beating up people and throwing them in jail as anti-Semites, including Jews. And then we hear they're going to do something about it. They say the Germans are going to stop sending arms to Israel. But that's not the truth at all. 40% of arms that flowed to Israel last year were from Germany. All they are halting is new contracts sometime in the future, and even then only in condition that it can be established that the particular items involved might be used against Gazan civilians. So it's a sham. I think the sublimity, the one no one mentions, is that in terms of a shock to society here, has been the total failure of official Jewish organisations in the West to come out against this. And they've always been the ones with their Holocaust education and blah, blah, blah. And these are the very people who are totally silent. The worst of them are complicit, they defend it, but mostly silent, won't dissent from Israel's actions. And just despite the fact, again, that same dichotomy of a growing number of opinion amongst younger Jewish people, totally in opposition to this. But the silence of official Jewish bodies in Western countries has been quite extraordinary. So this brings us to the question, what is Zionism? Funnily enough, the term hardly, you won't hear it in Israel. They don't use that term in Israel, because it's an archaic term. It refers to something long ago, you know, like the Gaelic League, or, you know, it was some bunch of Europeans doing something. Israelis don't refer to themselves as Zionists. They call themselves Israelis, or just quite simply Jews. And the same, they don't talk about Palestinians, they call them Arabs. Okay? So it's Jews and Arabs. And that's, for most Israelis, that's the matter of fact of it. They don't use the term Zionism, which is another reason why we should think about why do we use it. Zionism is really now a Western term. And it encompasses many people who are not Jews at all. And the most glaring example are what are called the Christian fundamentalist, Christian Zionists in America. Because they're actually totally anti-Semites. Because in their view of things, the Jews have to gather in the land of Israel before Armageddon can happen. The Great Rapture, I think it's called. And these are the most ardent supporters of Israel in the United States. But in a way, although there's millions of them, they're type of politically not as important as is made out. Much more important are your middle-ranking politicians, higher-ranking politicians who are so tied into the geostrategic and so forth links to Israel. Think of people like Tony Blair and people like this. And say the present British cabinet, even after reshuffled, it's even worse. Foreign Minister, Defence Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, Prime Minister, all members of Labour Friends of Israel. Okay. So I think what we have today is in that area, in Palestine, we have Jewish nationalism on a rampage, supported by its Zionist supporters in the West. And remember, what also makes it so problematic for Jewish people who are not Israelis or whatever, is that Israel has constitutionally established itself as a Jewish state. And that's been made explicit only in recent years. And so young Jews ask themselves, can I be Jewish without being a Zionist, and so on. Okay. So going back to the origins, Oliver Sears, who I've mentioned already and gets a lot of free space to expound his views in the Irish Times, he made a great mistake recently by reminding us of Theodor Herzl. Now, Theodor Herzl was the founder of modern Zionism, claiming that his vision, and Sears was claiming that his vision was of a modern, inclusive, secular state, which was a state for the Jewish people, but also open to all others. But now that he reminded us of him, it's good to go back to look at Herzl's book, which is very hard to get. I don't think it's even in print in English now, currently. And I believe it's very hard to get in Israel. And the book was called Der Judenstaat, which means the Jewish state. And for him, the Jewish people were a nation, but a nation without a place, and some place had to be found for them to build a mighty and efficient modern state, which he meant in terms of a European state. And he held that assimilated or unenthusiastic Jews should be shrugged off and left behind, and only those imbued with this vision should undertake it. The Jews were not a people trapped in a colony wishing to assert its national rights, but a settler colonial enterprise to impose a European group and a European state on territory elsewhere inhabited currently by other people. And explicit in their Judenstaat is Herzl's proposition that this is not possible to do without the backing of a major power. And he looked around at what major powers were available, the Ottomans, where Palestine was, and the Germans, they weren't interested, and he settled for the British. And originally they thought in terms of maybe they could clear out a chunk of Uganda and settle there. But eventually they did settle on the Palestine as the goal. And Britain as the power that would enable it, because it would also come together with Britain's interests as a major power in that region. Now it should be said that for many years Zionism was a very unpopular and marginal idea among European Jews. There was anti-Semitism in Europe, sure, which lampooned Jewry as not a religion but a dangerous separate race. When you think of the irony of this, Jews themselves, who were mostly assimilated, rejected the idea that they were a separate race. He said, I just happen to be Jewish. No, I'm an Englishman who happens to be Jewish, or I'm a German who happens to be Jewish. I am not a separate people. And by you telling us I'm a separate people, you're giving people reasons why we should not be living here, but should be elsewhere. So Jews really rebelled very much against this idea. It was very much a marginal taste amongst European Jews. And nowadays it's the exact opposite. If you deny that the Jews are a people or a nation, you're an anti-Semite. If you say they're only a religion, you're an anti-Semite. So it's a really strange thing that got turned on its head. And where did Jews go who wanted to leave Europe, whether for anti-Semitic, because of anti-Semitism, or usually for other reasons like everybody else? They went to the US of A. In the 1880s, there were just 250,000 Jews in America, and the vast majority of these were German Jews. And they hadn't left because there was anti-Semitism, because there was no anti-Semitism in Germany in the 19th century. And the fact is, there was a huge exodus of Germans in general to the United States in the last decades of the 19th century, 3 million of them, and the Jewish emigration was just part and parcel of this. And then the Jewish population in America then exploded after 1890, mainly with a mass inflow of Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, from the Russian Empire, in other words, everything from Poland eastwards, and especially from Ukraine, where there was a virulent anti-Semitism. And this brought the number in America from 250,000 to over 3 million within 20 years. Now what was interesting is that all this later wave of East European Jewish emigration to America took place at the same time as the Zionist project was trying to attract people to Palestine. And in that whole period, 30,000 followed the call of Herzl and moved to Palestine. Now compare 30,000 compared to this 3 million that had gone to the States. Zionism had no attraction to European Jews at the time. And when they arrived in Palestine, they found there were already 20,000 Jews there, native Jews as they called them, who had no desire to set up as a separate community. They lived in that very mixed, weaving society that existed in the Ottoman Empire, where all types of faiths and ethnic groups, they all had their role in society and they mixed and wove together. And these people wanted nothing to do with building a Zionist state. And their descendants to this day in Israel give the regime an awful headache, because some of them don't even accept the legitimacy of the state. So by 1914 it looked like Zionism was going nowhere very fast. It looked like a hopeless cause. But the Zionist idea, if you like the non-Jewish Zionist idea, already had fans in Europe. Take the English 19th century Prime Minister Lord Salisbury, who for a mixture of Christian fundamentalist, anti-Semitic and imperialist reasons thought it would be a wonderful idea to establish a white Jewish English colony in the Middle East under British tutelage. It would also get rid of the Jews of England. This was a utopian area as the area was then, and a utopian idea as the area was then part of the sprawling, multi-ethnic, multi-faith civilization of the Ottomans. But England was already developing designs on that. It might also surprise people to know that the earliest, most forceful, powerful sponsors of Zionism after the turn of the century and later in the founding of Israel itself were themselves thoroughgoing anti-Semites. So we come to the First World War, which changed everything, as the biggest event in 20th century history, and we're living with the consequences of it to this day. Without World War I, there would have been no Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, would have been no Hitler, no Versailles Treaty, no Middle East turmoil, and no Gaza. And that's a fact. You can trace every one of those massive events to the turmoil of the First World War. And also an irony, because of later history, is that at the start of World War I, Germany was regarded as the great protector state of the Jews. When the German army advanced into Ukraine in 1914, they were greeted as liberators. And probably even more telling, in Ireland, in Belfast and Dublin, shops of Jews and so on were attacked because these were believed to be the Jews were German fifth colonists. In Belfast, there had been a Jewish mayor for a year. I think his name is Jaffa, maybe someone knows. And he was stripped of his honours of the city by the city council. The Jews were regarded as German fifth colonists. By 1917, Britain was hopelessly losing its war. The Germans were advancing in the west. They had knocked the Russians out of the war. And there was a huge effort to try and get the US into the battle. And to maintain support at home and to lure in the US, Britain pushed this line about that they were leading a great crusade for the freedom of small nations, which, as we know, seduced our own home rulers. And the idea, this term came up, the right of people to self-determination, though as would become clear, that only applied to peoples in enemy states, and many of whom had never sought self-determination. Okay. And it was in this context that the Balfour Declaration of November 1917 was made, promising a homeland for the Jews in Palestine, which would not infringe on the rights of others there. It was all carefully worded. And interestingly enough, one member of Cabinet fiercely objected to this, and the one member of Cabinet who severely objected to it was the Jewish member of Cabinet. And that was Edwin Samuel Montagu. He was Secretary of State for India, and he called the Balfour Declaration fundamentally an anti-Semite document, denying his identity as an Englishman, forcing him to adopt an identity he did not have. It would mean that England's Jews were not truly English and their ultimate home was elsewhere. He feared it would fuel prejudice and called for Jews to be sent off to where they belonged. He wrote a memo to Cabinet opposing it, and the title of the memo was "The Anti-Semitism of the Present Government." Denouncing the declaration, he said, "I wish to place on record my view that the policy of His Majesty's government is anti-Semitic in result and will prove a rallying ground for the anti-Semites in every country in the world." And so it has proved. I'd also mention Churchill in this regard. In 1920, Winston Churchill he had a very strange view of the whole thing. He set out a full-British case for the Zionist project. It was an article called "Zionism versus Bolshevism, Struggle for the Soul of the Jewish People." He described the Jews as the most formidable, the most remarkable race, but he differentiated between good Jews and bad Jews. Okay. The conflict between good and evil proceeds uneasily in the breast of man, nowhere reaches such an intensity as in the Jewish race. It may well be that this same astounding race may at the present time be the actual process of producing another system of morals and philosophy, Bolshevism, as malevolent as Christianity was benevolent, which, if not arrested, would shatter irretrievably all that Christianity has rendered possible. Churchill's argument was that there was a big problem with the Jews because they were internationalists and they were Bolshevists, and what needed to happen was to root them in a national state. And this was Zionism, offered the prospect for doing this. This is Churchill, which he saw then as the term the Jew being replaced as a nationality, replacing them as a dangerous internationalism. And he was quick to remark that national Jews would also fulfill an important function as a white British colony on the Suez Canal to defend the land bridge to British India. This is what he said. But if, as may well happen, there should be created in our lifetime by the banks of the Jordan a Jewish state under the protection of the British Crown, which might comprise 3 or 4 million of Jews, an event in the history of the world which would, from every point of view, be beneficial and would be especially in harmony with the truest interests of the British Empire. Now we can see in the 1920s the governor of Palestine, on behalf of the British, of Mandate Palestine, a chap called Sir Andrew Storr, he summarised the British concept in the following words, and this will have great resonance for Irish ears. He called it a colony gradually built up in Palestine would evolve for Britain into, quote, a loyal little Jewish Ulster in a sea of hostile Arabism. Okay. An extraordinary quote. Strangely enough, we can really call them British imperialist Zionists. They were anti-Semites. And they also believed that the Roman experience of a Jewish state 2,000 years ago was of a chaotic and explosive entity, and that the Romans had been right to destroy it. But the new homeland would be different because it would be retained within the benevolent and under the strict guiding hand of the British Empire. Okay. And it can be added that large population transfers and settlement was not an unusual thing in the British imperial project, as we well know in Ireland. As late as the 19th century, as willing colonists from Britain had shrunk to zero, they began to move large numbers of Indians from India to populate towns in their African colonies and to develop modern economic systems there. And we all know that came back to haunt Britain in the 1960s as their empire dissolved. And before World War I, when they were planning the destruction of the Ottoman Empire, part of this was that they would secure Mesopotamia, Iraq, and populate clear out the Euphrates basin of locals, of Arabs, and populate it with Indians. These were serious plans by British government at the time. Now, as we know, Britain and France decided how they would carve up in the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, how they would carve up the Middle East. But throughout the 1920s, Britain would struggle to create its loyal little Jewish Ulster. As Jews leaving Europe, mostly escaping revolutionary upheaval or else nationalist pogroms in Ukraine, where they wanted to go was still the US. In the whole period from 1917 to 1923, 150,000 Jews from this part of Europe, mostly from this part of Europe, left for America, while just a fifth of this number, 35,000, were attracted to the wonderful new British Mandate Palestine. That's a fifth. The first boost for the project came when the US shut its doors to immigrants in general in 1924, setting very small quotas of what would let in from various countries. And even with this situation, only a further 60,000 arrived in Palestine throughout the rest of the 1920s, mostly from Poland, which had been taken over by an anti-Semitic nationalist government, who were beginning to persecute the Jews in Poland. Of course, the fortunes of the colony changed a bit, especially with the rise of National Socialism. But still the total in the whole Palestine project was about 225 Jews. Between 1929 and 39, about 250,000 Jews arrived in Europe, though also a similar number going to America. And the German Jews were the big element in this, And in this there was a deal between radical Zionist organizations and the German state, who wanted to be rid of their Jews, whereby they could emigrate to Palestine with part of their capital, bring their capital with them with a cut left for the Nazis. And this continued on for several years during the 1930s. I think, what was his name? Ken Livingstone, who was the popular mayor of London in the 1990s, he lost his position, was expelled from the Labour Party for mentioning these facts. That there was this collaboration between very radical Zionist groups in Nazi Germany in the 30s to get German Jews to Palestine. But still, by the World War II, just 450,000 Jews were in Palestine, which was less than 30% of the population. And it was with this influx that Arab resistance only started to stir. There were riots in 1929 and a full-scale Arab revolt in 1936, which went on to 1939. But these were put down with ruthless violence by the British and with Jewish death squads who were working with them that later formed the core of the Zionist army. The revolt was crushed with mass killings, mass hangings, burning of property, population expulsions. And of course there was a bit of an Irish element in this, because the Palestine police, one of the brutal forces involved, had a large number of ex-RIC men in their ranks, and also the Royal Ulster Rifles participated in this. But most importantly for the Palestinians, their whole civil leadership that had evolved over many centuries was utterly destroyed, and their political leadership to the extent they have one. But with these events, there's the emergence of a guy called Zabotinsky, and what was called, the British Peel Commission in 1937 to 39 decided on a plan to partition Palestine in the form of two statelets under the empire, an Arab statelet and a Jewish one. It's interesting that De Valera fought very hard against this at the League of Nations in the 1930s, and gets no credit for it nowadays. You hardly ever hear of it. He was in favour of a single entity of the people who were actually living in the territory and working out a polity that would work for both of them. When Churchill was asked his opinion of this, he said in a letter to his cousin, the Duke of Westminster, "I do not agree that the dog in the manger," the Palestinians, the Arabs in Palestine, "that a dog in the manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wide race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place." Okay, just briefly, the World War II, of course, and the Holocaust of Jews in Europe and of many other peoples radicalised the situation. The British, Ernest Bevin, the great British trade union leader and the organiser of the British working class power in Britain, is often traduced as an anti-Semite. He wasn't an anti-Semite, he just wasn't a Zionist. As Foreign Secretary in Attlee's 1945 government, he refused to accept the nationalist logic of Zionism, which was consuming the British Labour left, led by figures like Richard Crossman and later Dennis Healy, who were very much at this stage already intertwined with the CIA and that element in the American rising Cold War system. Bevin had held out for enabling Palestine with an existing mixed population to evolve as a single entity. But Britain was bankrupt and its imperial will broken under the pressure of the US and mounting Zionist group terror. It threw in the towel and handed the problem over to the UN. The UN had been founded in 1944 and simply took over the Peel Commission's plan, incorporating even the Balfour Declaration in its entirety into its new mandate on Palestine. It agreed a partition of Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state, with the Jewish state, although just 30% of the population, getting 55% of the territory and most of its greener areas and coastline. Why the Soviet Union agreed to this, I'm not sure, and I think it's still a matter, I don't think it has ever been clarified. The Soviet Union had established an internal Jewish autonomous republic for those of its Jews of a Zionist inclination. But I assume myself was part of Stalin's desperate efforts at that time to try and halt the slide to an East-West confrontation on which the West was already intent. Maybe a last attempt to appease them, not least as early post-war elections in Eastern Europe were seeing majorities being won by anti-Semitic, proto-fascist parties, despite the best manipulative efforts of the communists. And with the hasty British withdrawal from Palestine, the baton passed to the US as the great new imperial protector, which all Zionists since Herzl had agreed was a prerequisite for their project. I'll just give you a quote. In 1945, the left in Western Europe was triumphant. The forces of racism and fascism lay smashed and defeated, and a new Europe seemed about to be born. That great and very brave dissenting Israeli historian Ilan Pappé recently described how Europe confronted its Jews in 1945. This is a quote from him, from a talk he gave a couple of months ago. When racism towards Jews reached its climax in the Holocaust, one moment after the end of the Second World War, not one European politician, not one European intellectual in West, Central and East Europe said to the Jews of Europe, "Come back to Europe, we will build together a Europe that is anti-racist, where a Holocaust or any kind of racism towards people would not happen." No, all the intellectuals of Europe, all the leaders of Europe came and said, "We very much like an idea that we heard from Christian evangelicals and some Jewish intellectuals. Europe can inherently not solve a Jewish problem, so we have a much better solution. We will build a Jewish state, a Western European state, Jewish state, at the heart of the Arab world, at the heart of the Muslim world, at the expense of the Palestinians." And if you think that someone might have objected, whether in 1882 with Herzl or 1945, wait a minute, even putting aside morality, international law or justice, is this even logical? But you would be wrong, no one said that. What was proposed was to colonize an Arab country, dispossess and Judaize it in the name of solving a European problem of racism. A powerful statement. And it can be said that few countries did much for the Jews during the war, with the exception of the Soviet Union, I might add, which even in the chaos of the German onslaught managed to withdraw nearly 2 million Jews from in front of the path of the German armies. It was them also who brought the Holocaust to an end, with their advances forcing the Nazis to desperately close camps in Poland and seek to erase evidence of their crimes. And it was they too who liberated Auschwitz in January 1945. So Israel was created in 1948 to solve Europe's and the US's Jewish problem. Despite this, many European Jews in Italy, Britain, France refused the offer and remained where they were. Those who did leave again wanted to go to the US, but some were given no option other than Palestine, now that the project was on. Many great European Jewish thinkers, including Hannah Arendt, Albert Einstein, and even that greatest writer to have come out of the Holocaust, if you can say that, things like that, Primo Levi, thoroughly rejected Zionism as a criminal nationalist imposition on a colonized people that could only end in moral collapse for the Jewish tradition. Now I should talk about the radical wing of Zionism, because this is what now came to the fore. As Britain's Palestine project faltered in the 1920s, with only a trickle of Jews showing any interest in moving there, a Polish Jew, Jabotinsky, he drew up a plan known as the Arden Wall. And listen carefully to Netanyahu these days. Nearly every second speech he gives, he uses that term, the Arden Wall. And this was a series of articles which Jabotinsky wrote and which later came out as a book for what was required to establish Jewish control over Palestine. He was elected to the International Zionist Executive in 1921, but resigned from it over what he thought was Weizmann's collaboration with the British and acceptance that the Jewish national home would not be wholly Jewish or Jewish dominated. He saw what was transpiring in Palestine in the 1920s as the failure of Zionism, though both he and Weizmann were at one in accepting Herzl's assumption of the absolute necessity of a great power behind the Jewish project. Jabotinsky saw Jewry as a European people. Quote, "We Jews have nothing in common what has denoted the East, and we thank God for that. The East to him was backward and passive, and characterized by social and cultural stagnation and despotism." That's a mentality which Edward Said, the great Palestinian writer, called Orientalism. Although the Jews originated in the East, they belonged to the West culturally, morally and spiritually. Zionism was not a return of the Jews to their homeland, but a colonial implant of Western civilization in the East. Jabotinsky originated a clear strategic expression of Zionism as a settler colonial project in the Middle East, allied with European imperialism against the Arabs. He set down two principles for a Jewish state, which became the core of the revisionist Zionist program. This was the territorial integrity that Israel would consist of all of biblical Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, from the Jordan to the sea, with the Jewish right to political sovereignty over the whole area conquered by the British. In the Arden Wall, he criticised the Zionist establishment for ignoring the problem of the Arab majority in Palestine, saying that it was a fancy belief to believe that they would be overawed by the technological prowess and economic capabilities of the Jews and would lead them to accept dominance by them. This is what you might nowadays call liberal Zionism. Jabotinsky said this was an absurd illusion, as any substantial people will fight its dispossession and expropriation, and he knew the Palestinians were a substantial people. Every native people in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized, he said. If the Jewish cause is just, he said, justice must triumph without regard to the ascent or descent of anyone else. Zionism, as a Jewish national movement, would have to physically conquer the Arabs for control of their land and territory, and the Arabs would have to be expelled. Zionists must develop a Jewish military force, what he called the metaphorical Arden Wall, so powerful that it would compel the Arabs to accept a Jewish state on their land, progress or not. Zionist colonization, he said, can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an Arden Wall, which the native population cannot breach. Okay. So this is the beginning, really, of what used to be called the Ottoman Garden of Eden for Arabs and Jews alike, becoming a hell on earth for the native population under British auspices. Hannah Arendt would describe Jabotinsky's revisionism as the fascist wing of the Zionist movement, but it would become its mainstream. In 2024, an article in the Jewish Standard noted, for the Israeli right-wing Likud party, which has been in power in the Jewish state for many years, it is Jabotinsky who is a political inspirator and ideological beacon. And the father of the current Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, was an assistant to Zev Jabotinsky's personal secretary in his youth. So what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank today, directed by Netanyahu and his government, is fulfillment of Jabotinsky's Arden Wall. So the British in retreat, the UN behind them, the great opportunity for Zionism had come. I think I don't need to go into it here. You all know what happened in those first years of establishing the state. And one of the best accounts was on this Ilan Pape. I'd recommend it to anyone. The ethnic cleansing of Palestine. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. How am I in time?
It's fine, it's about 3:36.
Okay, we'll just zip ahead. Okay, maybe we leave the rest to our discussion period. Maybe just to note on Palestinian nationalism, if you can call it that, the nation state has become the form of human organisation takes today. Okay? Until the 19th century, this was not so. There were numerous peoples living in all types of realms and configurations outside the European empires, such as in the Ottoman Empire. But the spread of the West destroyed many of these, and peoples who did not get themselves a state were in serious trouble, and many of them have totally disappeared. It's interesting that this is the system of politics, if you like, in the world today, that is the basic unit of the UN. So this is what we need to live in and succeed in. And Arthur Griffith, a founder of Sinn Féin, came to the conclusion that in the modern world, between the individual and the mass of humanity, stands and must continue to stand a great fact, the nation. And peoples that fail to sort themselves into nations, states, as I said, some have disappeared. So the Palestinians were a people, and remember Pádraig Pearse said in the 19th century that the 19th century was the story of a disorganized people gradually forging itself into a nation. And this, in a way, is what happened to the Palestinians too. They were dispersed, diverse people in that part of the Ottoman Empire, living side by side with Jews and others, Druze, all types of groups. But what was inflicted on them by Jabotinsky's followers has forced them gradually to develop a coherent existence as a national people. Their leadership had been smashed and wiped out by the British in the 30s, but they did generate the Palestine Liberation Organization in the 60s, which became an umbrella group for all the different groups and factions and parties. Okay, and like the Irish, the Irish were also formed in this process, if you like, this anti-imperialist process, which gave rise to a state which has an essentially anti-imperialist identity. And I would just mention in terms of that, I remember Robert Fisk, who knew Ireland very well and spent a lot of time here, and he wrote a great book about the fate of Lebanon called Pity the Nation. And in it he was really struck by the Irish soldiers, UNIFIL soldiers, and he reckoned that in the time that the Irish were based there, about 50,000 young men from every village in Ireland, every townland, had passed through doing service in UNIFIL and brought back the stories of what they saw. And what did they say? When he looked into the eyes of a Palestinian, they recognized their own story. And with the arrogance and the racist arrogance of the Israeli army and so forth. And that this is really the backbone of the extraordinary solidarity you see in Ireland towards, even in every village that you see in Ireland towards the Palestinians. And I would just say, Fintan O'Toole had a piece trying to distance himself, he's a very clever man, distancing himself from what was going on in Israel. He had a piece in the Irish Times to show, because there was what the Taoiseach and Taoiseach called an international campaign to smear Ireland as anti-Semitic. You might remember that a couple of weeks ago. But of course, Fintan O'Toole, because of his views on the Irish state, could not bring himself to talk about the record of the Irish state. He had to reach back to its prehistory, to quote O'Connell and Davitt, to show that the Irish tradition was the opposite of Zionism. But the fact is that this tradition lived on very powerfully in the Irish state itself. And I mentioned at the start of our talk things that De Valera did at the League of Nations in opposition to the partition plans for Palestine of the 1930s. And there are many other examples. The role of Frank Aitken in the UN in the 1960s. He initiated the setting up of the UNWRA, which is the great UN relief organisation, and the one connection many Palestinians had to a means to survive what was happening now, right down to today. And we see the pressure from the US and Israel to destroy that organisation. So there is a very strong connection there. And in 1980, under Charles Haughey, there was Ireland issued a thing called the Bahrain Declaration, which made Ireland the first state in the EU both to recognise Palestinian national rights, the right to a state, and the PLO as their political representation. It caused outrage at the time among Zionists and their friends, but it was followed not long after by the EU itself in a more much milder position called the Venice Declaration, which accepted that Palestinians too had a right to self-determination. And we can go into other aspects of that if people wish to. There was just one or two things. I was a bit dismayed to see Ireland lining up with, I don't know how many other, about 10 countries, was it, with Canada and Finland and etc., recently about they're going to recognise the state of Palestine, finally, and calling for various things to be done over the Gaza thing. But it's full of these concessions to the Zionists. Number one is the hostages must be returned. They don't mean the 10,000 hostages that Israel are holding in their prisons at the moment. They mean the 20 the Hamas are holding. And so forth, but we can go into the current political situation if people wish. I'm very worried about a particular aspect. While the current programme for government undertook to pass the Occupied Territories Bill, and as we know they were really desperately trying to get out of that applying to services as well as goods. Something that has gone under the radar is that that government, I believe under Fine Gael pressure, also adopted a commitment that Ireland would adopt in law the definition of anti-Semitism proposed by the International Holocaust Remembrance Association. This is very dangerous because that, and it's funny, the actual author of that definition, who did it in goodwill, I think, has been outraged by how that definition has been used and abused, because it effectively enabled states, by adopting it, to silence criticism of Israel and to even declare questioning the existence of Israel as a criminal offence. And if people are active in politics about Palestine in Ireland, they should really focus on preventing this being adopted. I would strongly urge people to do, because it's this part of this drip absorption of Ireland, the NATO structures and all the rest that's currently going on, that people really need to snap to attention about. And just as a very final thing, I do think, first of all, that this genocide is not something that began on the 8th of October 2023, but it's been going on since at least 1948. People have to be very clear about that. This is simply an escalatory step, and it's not only happening in Gaza. What's happening in the West Bank is worse than anything that's happened in the West Bank in 30 years, but it's because of the horrendous nature of the Gaza business it hardly gets any attention. I think we have an opportunity to again play a role at the UN level if we had a government with the guts to do so, and we will see if we do. Just as a very final point, this idea of does Israel have a right to exist? And this is one, there's the Hasbara book, which is Israel issues as what people should use when you're fighting Israel's case in arguments in the press and letters to the papers and so on. And one of them is, whenever anyone is going on about any of these issues, throw at them. Do you not say Israel has a right to exist? And you say, well, don't know, anti-Semite, okay, and so on. I would mention that the same question arose in relation to Germany in 1945. And during the inter-allied discussions about what to do with Germany, a US cabinet minister said, it is not a question of whether Germany has a right to exist, but whether Germany deserves to exist after what had happened. And interestingly, it was the Soviet Union that intervened at this stage with a very famous thing. They said the Hitlers come and go, but the German people remain. And it was thereafter the Soviets have promoted, believe it or not, that there should be a single German state created, a neutral German state, single German state created in Central Europe. Maybe there's a lesson for us there on several issues. So I will just end with a brilliant statement on that very same question by the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territories, the wonderful and very brave Francesca Albanese. And she was responding to a propagandized journalist who asked her, did she not think Israel had a right to exist? And she said, Israel does exist. It is a recognized member of the UN. Besides this, there is no such thing in international law as a right of a state to exist. Does Italy have a right to exist? Italy exists. Does France have a right to exist? France exists. But if tomorrow Italy and France decided to merge and wanted to become inter-France, fine, that is up to them. What is enshrined in international law is the right of a people to exist. So the state is there, the state of Israel is there, it is protected as a member of the UN. Does this justify the erasure of another people? Hell no. Not 75 years ago, that's 1948, nor 57 years ago, that was 1967, surely not today. Where is the protection of the Palestinian people from erasure, annexation, illegal occupation and apartheid? This is what we need to discuss.
Yeah, before Helena puts it open to discussion, I see Tony has the attendance sheet. Will you circulate it around, and anybody who hasn't signed it already, would you please do so? And Muriel's also circulating as well.
Thank you very much, Philip. I don't know about the rest of you, but I learned an awful lot from that. It's very well researched, and if it's not already published, I hope it will be. It's a thing that I feel keen to recommend to somebody about the history of Zionism. So, I'm going to open the floor to questions and comments.